Hello, my fellow sovereign nodes. Before we get started today, I wanted to make a quick mention about the one-on-one healing sessions that are being offered by members of the Decentralized Consciousness community. There are currently 7 of us that are offering these amazing sessions. I've done multiple with each member and have found that in each case, they have met me with their specific, unique talents exactly where I needed and what I needed help with. If this at all resonates with you, sparks your curiosity, check out bitcoin-consciousness.com/sessions and reach out to one of us. Thanks for listening and enjoy this episode. Welcome to the Decentralized Consciousness podcast. Today on the podcast, I have Avi Burra, and actually Avi's wife, Monica, has been on the podcast before, and she was the one that connected us. Avi also has his own podcast called PlebChain Radio, and we'll probably get into that a little bit today as well. But Avi, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It is my honor to be here, Caleb. And I have to say, my wife is certainly a tough act to follow on any podcast. So I'm almost certain I will not do much justice.
Just in case he's listening, you gotta.
Oh, I mean it.
Yeah, no, definitely. So before we started recording, and hopefully we can pick up where you were just where we left off. We were talking about this concept of humility and experiencing a light ego death through Bitcoin. Maybe you could rehash and continue on that thread.
Yeah. So maybe if you don't mind, Caleb, I'll take a step back and just walk through some of my Bitcoin prehistory, and that leads up to that moment.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Look, I'm an engineer by training. I've studied electrical engineering, worked in robotics for a while, pivoted to financial engineering. And for those who are unfamiliar, that is a real thing. Financial engineering, where it's fun. Or some people jokingly refer to it as financial alchemy. Basically, they teach you the tips and tricks that brought the global economy to its knees in 2008. The restructuring of cash flows, right? Securitizations, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, all that fun stuff, all the mathematics behind it. That's financial engineering. So that really is my background, and I worked in that world, thankfully at startups, not at any major bank, although our clients were banks at the startup. And then somewhere along the line, around 2016 or so, after the startup I was working at for a few years, sort of faded into went to startup heaven or hell. For all I know, someone reached out to me, given my background in securitization, and asked me if I could help them with this cryptocurrency exchange-traded instrument they were trying to structure, which they wanted to trade on the Gibraltar Stock Exchange. So this was in the Wild West days still, right? Even though 2016 is late-ish, in some sense, in the Bitcoin world, right? It's about what is it, 7 years after the Genesis block, but it was still Wild West. So really started paying attention to this space, even though I'd heard about Bitcoin around 2010 or so, but never really got into it too much back then. Started paying attention, purchased my first Bitcoin, and then I call this the curse of being an engineer. I got distracted with the shiny technology underneath, and of course all the other crypto stuff that was floating around. Oddly enough, it was right around when I started getting engaged in this space, was around the time the Ethereum DAO hack happened, which led to the hard fork between Ethereum Classic and Ethereum. So I was a spectator to all of that. Of course, the block size wars were heating up right around then, and I didn't. Again, I sort of read a little bit about Bitcoin, didn't really understand it, but got more interested in the technology itself, right? The way people were describing the Byzantine generals problem and all of that stuff. So that led me on a journey of working in the enterprise permissioned blockchain world. I was a product lead at a startup, a fairly prominent startup, which in fact, the startup which coined the phrase blockchain, not Bitcoin. So I was there for about three. Yeah. I was there for about 3 or 4 years. Got to travel the world, work with some of the largest companies in the world, very large stock exchanges and market infrastructures, even large healthcare clearing houses, selling this technology, which really all it involved was identifying a narrow use case, building a proof of concept, right? Not a production application, but a proof of concept for took about 3 or 4 months, getting a nice PR article saying, blockchain technology solves XYZ use case, right? Get the headlines, go and present at one of those blockchain conferences, talk about that. And then, but in the background, what was happening was we would be working, typically especially in 2016, 2017, a lot of these large companies had their innovation units with, decent budgets to fund these science experiments. And then once the experiment was concluded, they would then recommend it to their the people who did the real work, right? The operations folks, the production people who took it into implementation. And every single time, every single proof of concept, this happened over and over again, would get killed there because all the inconvenient questions around scaling would come up, around privacy, so on and so forth. And almost invariably, the solution was, oh yeah, we can just centralize it. You want speed? Yeah. We'll just centralize it a little bit, right? I mean, people talk about the trilemma, the decentralization trilemma, and it's very real, right? If you can't have decentralization and a system that scales easily and gives you privacy, right? You got to pick 2 out of the 3, and because these were startups that are doing it, they would pick the centralization route because that was the easiest way to achieve scale. And then eventually the projects would die on the vine. So after about 3 years of this, in fact, somewhat ashamed to admit, 4 years, almost 4 years of this, I had a bit of a slow aha moment, right? Which sounds a bit ironic, but the first sort of seed was planted in my head. And this happened completely organically, just through my own experience with these projects, was, could it be that the only meaningful use case for this technology, this blockchain technology that I've been working on, is a peer-to-peer electronic cash, which gets rid of all third parties and is truly between the sender and the receiver. And I just mulled on that and it took me a few months of mulling on that until that realization really sunk in. And that was the moment, or that period, right? That 6-month period sometime in the second half of 2019, leading into early 2020, where we're talking about humility before we started recording, and that was it, right? That I realized that there was, the sheer arrogance with which I was going into this, and by the way, taking a couple of steps back into the block size was, I was somewhat curious about what was going on back in 2016, 2017. I didn't fully understand it. I tried to ask some questions. And, well, Bitcoiners being Bitcoiners back then were somewhat dismissive because maybe I wasn't asking the questions, or maybe I sounded like an altcoiner when I was asking the questions, right? So they were somewhat dismissive. And that at that point I said, you know what, screw these guys. I don't want to have anything to do with them and their silly project.
Yeah.
So that was another reason I somewhat doubled down. So fast forward back again to that second half of 2019, as I was going through this realization, it became very apparent to me that I'd been incredibly arrogant in assuming that because I was an engineer and because I understood certain elements of the technology, I dismissed so many of these people. And through that realization came an incredible humility at that point, saying, you know what, all these, yes, these people might have been, I might have, or actually, let me rephrase that. I might have perceived them as being mean and dismissive back then, but they were right. And I'm going to go back and listen to a lot of them again and see what they have to say. And yeah, so in some sense, Caleb, it was like I called it a light ego death because my ego was what was guiding me for the last 3 years, and I was finally able to put that aside and relearn, right? Admit that I was wrong. And, you know, that can be a shattering experience. You've certainly heard stories, right, of people when they realize they were wrong, they're shattered. For me, it had the opposite effect. I felt completely energized. I felt such a calmness in being able to say, I was wrong, and that's okay. I know nothing, and I'm here to learn. It was an incredibly calming and almost transformative experience for me to be able to then use that and start learning. And you know, I haven't looked back since then.
Wow. So what do you do now?
In the Bitcoin world, as you mentioned, I am the co-host of PlebChain Radio, which is a Nostr and Bitcoin focused weekly podcast. We typically record it as a live Nostr Nest, which is the Nostr alternative to Twitter Spaces. Way better, by the way, even at this early stage.
Of course.
in many ways, it's better. So we recorded as a live Nostr Nest, and that show's been gaining popularity. We're on episodes either 62 or 63. And that's, you know, it's once a week, so we've been doing it pretty consistently for over a year. We're finally seeing some fruits of that in terms of just people, and I don't mean fame or popularity. It's just people reaching out and saying, "Hey, that was an incredible conversation you had, and I learned something new from that. Thank you." Right. More and more people reach out and say that. So that's one thing I do in the Bitcoin world. The other is I'm also an author. I wrote the first, I believe, and no one's contested me on this, but what I'm claiming is the first long form book of fiction on Bitcoin, and I released that about in November of last year, 2023. So that book to me was my real proof of work in Bitcoin. I mean, it was a true labor of love. The podcast too, but it's obviously far less work than writing a 400-page novel. So that's what I do in the Bitcoin world, and then I evangelize this both Bitcoin and Nostr as much as I can. Travel to have been traveling to a lot of conferences to speak about these topics. Probably will cut down a little bit on the travel because it's just been getting exhausting, and not to mention, at some point you got to say, am I stacking sats or am I traveling? Right? Yeah. Once you've been traveling quite a bit. So that's what I do in the Bitcoin world, and then in the fiat world, I work in healthcare at a large healthcare technology company. I run a team of about 30 people, and we're working on some healthcare innovations. But really, it's nice. But my heart is in Bitcoin, as you can imagine.
Yeah. It's so interesting that you mentioned the heart as well. Comparing these two spaces, the fiat world. I mean, I would say that the financial engineering is like probably the extreme fiat case, in my opinion. Like, not to, I guess, disparage anyone, but I think, and a lot of coiners also can echo the sentiment, which is, are these businesses and all of these corporations that are essentially creating tokens, and or it doesn't even have to be a token security, whatever, are they actually creating value for people, or are they just, trading around a representation of somebody else's value? It's like representation. It's like paper forms on top of paper forms on top of paper forms. It's like the ultimate manifestation of fiat. So how does the because you're in both spaces currently, how do the two differ for you?
You mean my old financial engineering job and being in Bitcoin right now?
Yeah, well, and that and your fiat job in the healthcare industry as well.
Yeah. Look, when I took this fiat job, this was after so I was working, I told you I worked at a startup, right? The blockchain or Bitcoin startup. And then for a brief period, I worked at a large consulting company, which had been working very closely with the startup, right? It was unfortunately that the enterprise blockchain world was incredibly incestuous. There were a small group of key players, and people just moved around, right? Worked at a consulting company. I'm not going to name names, but it's a fairly large one, infamous one too. And then at that point, I said, I have to exit. I cannot live with myself at this point. And of course, right around then, the pandemic hit, right? So we're talking about the 2019, 2020 period as I was going through this realization. The pandemic hit, and it just became really hard to move jobs. And I came close on multiple occasions to just quitting without any other option. Stop myself in my tracks because, well, my family was living in New York City back around the pandemic, and it became untenable for us with the lockdown. So we had to find a place, and we moved 3 hours away from the city. But the long story short, I needed a job to get a mortgage, right? So it was just, I was caught in an impossible position. I wouldn't have been approved for a mortgage if I didn't have a job. So stuck around there. But once the dust had settled there, I said, okay, that's it. I'm done. I'm moving to healthcare, right? It's at least it's not dirty. It's not, I'm not selling snake oil. And I did that. Mm-hmm. And it was fine for a while. At least I could tell myself the story that, this is an innovation team. And if I can make an impact in reducing the healthcare costs in this country, in fixing a completely broken healthcare system, if I can mitigate that even 1 or 2%, I'm actually having a positive impact on the world. So at least that was a story I told myself, and to keep myself sane. And I think at the end of the day, look, I work at a large company, and the fact of the matter is, maybe a side effect of one of my products reaching market could be some minor mitigation in costs, if at best case scenario. But the more likely scenario is, in the case we're successful, my team is successful, is my company's stock price goes up by, a handful of basis points or a few percentage points as a result of it, right? So the question, so that at that point, it's like, well, what am I doing? There is no meaning or purpose and I'm spending 8 hours of my day doing something like this when there's Bitcoin, right? that I could be focused on something that is just genuinely impactful to the world. So yeah, it's an odd place to be in, Caleb. I'm not going to lie. But it's, I mean, Bitcoin jobs at this point, or the Bitcoin space, I'm not at the stage in life. I have a young son. I can't just toss that away. Take a major, or at least I haven't convinced myself of this yet anyway, that take a major risk that could put their financial well-being at risk.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and I think that's completely reasonable, and I think it's a story that a lot of Bitcoiners share, because we have such a passion for the mission of Bitcoin and all things surrounding it. The humility that it gives us. So it's not just the money, but it's this movement as a whole. And so many of us want to be able to create and share and participate in this space. And yeah, it can be very tough to not just like know where to contribute, but once you begin contributing, to feel like you're actually making an impact. In the case of the Decentralized Consciousness podcast, it's it's an open platform. So even if you, for instance, wanted to publish your own episode through the platform, yes, there are some elements of centralization, that we would probably talk to some of the some people like myself and some of the other people that have been in it for a while to make sure that things are kind of aligning. However, the idea is that it's an open platform for people to come and express that authenticity. And, for the longest time, because I've been into Bitcoin since 2019, I should say, is really kind of when I started falling down the rabbit hole. Mine was also kind of slow, and then my son was born, and then that's when it really all shattered. But for me, it was like, okay, I'd try something, and it wouldn't be much, but I would try something, and I would get little to no, this isn't it, and it wasn't until, for me, I just stopped becoming attached to the outcome and stopped caring about the statistics. I stopped caring about, trying to gain a bunch more followers. And what I really placed the focus on was creating from my heart, right? And there's a level of discipline for me that is kind of still required, because there are still times where I don't know, I feel like I would rather do things that are what I would view and judge as being wasteful. So I would rather do something else that isn't necessarily productive, but because I hold myself to this higher standard of just producing something, and really because that something is based in an action that is very authentic and something that I actually want to do and explore. Like the conversation that we're having right now, the way that I do my best to view it is not to provide entertainment, not to enlighten or change minds or anything like that, as much as it is just to have a conversation where I can satisfy my own curiosities and enlighten myself, but then also have it be public at the same time. So, it's like, and it falls right in the of the thesis of Bitcoin, which is self-sovereignty. It's like the ultimate self-accountability. And it sounds kind of selfish actually, but it's like, I'm doing this for myself. I'm very interested in these topics, and I want to contribute something to the space because I feel good doing that. And so that's why I'm, building or creating things that genuinely inspire me and interest me. And that's the amazing thing about Bitcoin and the people around it.
Yeah, and I think that is the only way to find meaning, purpose, alignment, grounding in what you do, which is you do something if it brings you joy, right? You do something because it fulfills or, or it scratches an itch that you have. I mean, it's sort of like what you're saying, Caleb. When I wrote the book, right, and there were times, especially early on in the book, I struggled a little bit getting the first five, writing the first 5 chapters, because I'd keep stopping and ask myself, who's going to read this? Right? I mean, this is so out there. Is anyone even going to get what I'm trying to say? And once I reached a stage where when I had to pause, and so I started writing my book in April of 2022, because I'd reached a point. The last 2 years, all I'd been doing is absorb through podcasts and books and so on about Bitcoin. And I'd reached a stage where I said, I need to create. So it took me about between April, May of 22 to about August, September of that year. I wrote the first 5 chapters and 5.5 chapters. And then I hit writer's block because of these reasons that I was telling you. I started doubting what I was doing.
Yep.
So I took about 5 or 6 months to get over that. And what helped was I asked myself, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to make millions of dollars or whatever, thousands of Bitcoin off this book? Or am I doing it so that I become famous? And the answer to all of them was a resounding no, right? That's not the main reason. The main reason is I'm writing this book because I have a story to tell, and it's fun. And once I was able to shift my mindset to that I'm doing this because I want to do this. That's my primary reason. The next 18 chapters, right? So there's a 24-chapter book. The next 18 flowed out between April of 2023 and August of 2023, right? So
Wow,
the vast majority of that book was written in those 4 months or so. So I think that really helped, that reframing. And or not even reframing, it was re-understanding, right? These weren't just words I told myself to motivate myself, right? It wasn't about motivation. It was about understanding understanding what I was doing to find inspiration, right? I think motivation and inspiration are two very different things, and I think inspiration is ideally what one should aspire to have, because that's what drives the purest actions, and motivation can be forced.
yeah, I think that there's a lot of forces within motivation, and in the fiat world, probably the most common is the fiat, is the money itself. But as we Bitcoiners know, when you stop being afraid of not having enough money because the money actually respects your time, then things really begin to fall apart. That motivation is like, okay, well, I'm not afraid to not earn this fiat money anymore, because I feel like I have so much more security, and I feel like I'm aligned with something so different than the fear set that I was aligned with before. And as you had mentioned, obviously we have families to feed, and so it's still certainly the case that it makes sense for many of us to earn that fiat income to support us, but also to earn our satoshis. And the more that we the more that we go deeper down this rabbit hole, the more time that we spend working on ourselves, I think that the more we just tend to create in a natural flow. And it's really amazing, the evolution that you kind of went through to be like, I'm not creating this book for anyone but myself. I'm creating it just because I want to. What is the book about, by the way?
Yeah, so the book is called 24. It's a book written in 24 chapters. It's about a young man who's almost 24 who discovers or who finds out that his father has suddenly passed away on a company outing. And as far as he's aware, his father is he's a mid to senior level manager at a boring reinsurance company. But one of his family friends at the funeral or the memorial service for his father comes up to him and says, look, there's something your father wanted me to teach you. And this lady is she's I guess a spiritual healer, if you will, right? And she teaches him this guided meditation technique, which in the book's universe is referred to as time projection. So the book is set in the very near past. It's actually it was set right around the time I started writing it, which is 2022, and it mirrors a lot of things that happened in the Bitcoin and the broader space around then. So this young man, Oliver, by the way, is he's a computer scientist. He has a master's degree in computer science. He's a young man. He's fresh out of grad school, and he took this job at a Web3 startup. So I've tried to mirror some of my experience. Obviously, the protagonist, Oliver, is a lot younger than I am, or than I was even when I was at the PlebChain company. So Oliver doesn't really know about Bitcoin. He's heard about it, but he's more of a Web3 guy. But anyway, so the spiritual healer teaches him this guided meditation where he's able to access memories from his past, which he might. And the idea behind the technique is it helps people dealing with trauma to access memories that were buried deep beneath the trauma, right? And this is true in hypnotherapy, right? It's in fact, Monica, my wife, is a hypnotherapist, among other things that she does in her psychotherapy practice. And she talks about these techniques where people do hide traumas, and there are guided techniques to access and process those traumas, right? Move it from the emotional hemisphere, excuse me, into the rational hemisphere, and finally process them. So this is sort of loosely based on that, but the twist here is in Oliver's case. So, well, in most people's cases, they're able to go back into the past using this time projection technique, access memories, find whatever resolution they're looking for, and emerge out of it with a new knowing. In Oliver's case, not only is he able to access his own memories, but he's able to access other people's past and their memories too, right? Because cool. He's synesthetic. So in one of his very early episodes, he sees an image of his father telling him, Oliver, there are 24 words and you need to find them. And Oliver has no idea what these 24 words are. But basically over the course of each chapter, he discovers one word per chapter. And in the process, he learns that his father was not just a boring reinsurance manager. There was more to him than that, which he had kept hidden from the family. And he learns about Bitcoin through Mad Hatter / Yoda character that shows up in these time projection episodes. It's a character that his subconscious mind has latched onto, which from his childhood bedtime stories that his dad used to tell him. So the name of the character is the Nonsmeister. And so he shows up, and the Nonsmeister claims to be the keeper of this place called the Time Chain. And Oliver has no idea what the Time Chain is. He's a Web3 guy, right? He's never really spent much time learning about Bitcoin. And the Nonsmeister is usually talking in riddles and poetry, and slowly teaches Oliver about the time chain, which Oliver eventually figures out is Bitcoin. And then he realizes that the 24 words are very specific to Bitcoin. So that's Oliver's journey from being a Web3 guy into a full-fledged Bitcoiner, right? So the book is written in 5 stages. There's disbelief, entropy, anger, uncertainty, and acceptance. Sort of almost mirrors the 5 stages of grief. But these to me were the 5 stages in Oliver's growth into Bitcoin maximalism. So yeah, I might give. I'll end up giving too many spoilers if I say more than that, Caleb. But it really is that journey that all of us guided through this figment of his imagination, his subconscious mind, taking him to these magical lands and teaching him about the time chain. And then, in the meantime, the real world stuff is happening too, right? There's the Celsius fiasco. There's the Luna happening in 22. FTX is blowing up. So all of that is happening in the backdrop to Oliver going on this hero's journey, if you will.
Very cool. Very cool. So you had mentioned that you were kind of mirroring Oliver's life to be a little similar to yours. So were you finding that as you were writing about him? I mean, I know that, you had mentioned that the last, I think you said 13 chapters of the book came in a much easier flow for you, but were you finding
18.
that as you 18 chapters? That's right. Yeah. Were you finding that as you were writing those last 18 chapters and doing so quickly, were you beginning to relate with him on a more, I guess, etheric level?
That's an interesting question, Caleb. Because I'd made Oliver 23 and he turns 24, keeping with the 24 theme in the last chapter, in the last scene of the book, or the penultimate scene of the book, I should say. Because the age difference was so large, I hate to say, I'm a lot older than Oliver, unfortunately. Maybe I didn't have such a strong connection where I felt I was him, or at least it was easy for me to dissociate, right? Because I would always say, yeah, but he's a kid. How would a kid think in this situation? Or how would me as a kid think in this situation? So maybe not such a strong connection, but I will say there were many moments, and maybe this is not particularly related to your question, but in those last 18 chapters, there were multiple moments where I would just sit down, hands on the keyboard, and then I'd look up 12 pages, right, which is almost 4,000 words were written. 3 hours had passed, and it felt like a blink of an eye. Happened multiple times, and it was just pure flow state. And I'd go back and read it, and I'd say, who wrote this? Where did this come from? So that was quite the experience for me, I have to say.
Yeah, that's super cool. So I was on Nostr the other day, and I saw this. Oh man, this meme that I did not think would turn into what it did. It became very deeply philosophical, but basically what it was an image, two different images. And the top image was a lion in a cage, and the bottom image was a lion in a prairie. And the caption on the top said, one of these lions has everything guaranteed. He's got food, he's got health care, he knows that he's safe. And the other one has ultimate responsibility, and he's got no guarantees. And his quality of life is completely his own responsibility. And I sent this to a couple of people, one of them being my dad, and my dad and I are pretty close, and he's not quite, I would say, spiritual. I think that I get a lot of my rationality from him. However, that's not to say that he is not willing to have deeper conversations. And he actually, responded with an excellent question, which is, which lion is happier? And I want to, I guess, ask you that question. Which lion do you think is happier in this meme?
I mean, certainly the one that's fully sovereign, right? The one, well, it is the one on the prairie. If
Yeah,
let me actually turn the question back at you, because I actually think it's a fairly obvious answer, Caleb. If the lion could talk, right, and you could ask the lion which one would you choose, which path would you choose? I mean, I'm almost certain every single lion would choose the prairie. What do you think?
Yeah, and I guess this is where, for me, it became very deep and very spiritual, because it depends. First of all, it depends on at what point in your life you ask them. So in their life, you ask them. If you were to ask the lion who has already lived most of his life in the cage, and you were to say, "Hey, do you want me to just go?" He'd be like, oh, "What? Well, what would I do for food? How would I survive?" A life where he's completely up to his own devices might actually be kind of terrifying to him. And I think that this is actually super relatable to a lot of people in the fiat consciousness, because we as Bitcoiners who are kind of evangelists for this ultimate sovereignty and this ultimate freedom, people are like, but no, that sounds like too much work. Like, for even on the money front, right? All the health stuff, these communities that form around Bitcoin aside, even just explaining to people, hey, you can take complete control of your money and have it in your own home if you want. You can have it on your phone. You have complete control over it. They're like, no, that's too risky. That's too scary. So the first line, it depends on when you're, well, both lines. It depends on at what point you're asking them. And the same would go for the second. So if the second one has lived a life on the prairie, being completely sovereign, you say, hey, I know it's a lot of work to go chasing after prey in the prairie all day long. I know that it's a lot of work, having to worry about where your next meal is going to come from. If you're going to have the right climate conditions, where shelter is going to be, would you like us to take care of that for you? You won't be able to move around, but we'll take care of it for you. I think that second line would be like, no, never. But to flip it on its head, if you were to basically look at those lines and go to those lines before they were born, and you were to talk to them as just pure life force, and talk to them as just pure beings,
right?
And you were to ask them, and you were to say, which experience would you rather have? I don't know that there would be necessarily a cut and dry answer. I think that one lion might want to live a life where he's like, yeah, I'd like to try out the one where everything's given to me, because I can always try again, right? I have the opportunity to experience tons and tons of different lives. And so it's not quite as cut and dry. And for me, it kind of lends to a level of compassion for the no coiners, right? The ones who are okay not being sovereign and not being accountable. And I think that this is a common idea across much of popular culture today. We all feel, not all, but it's very common for people to feel that my belief system should be your belief system, because when you don't have the same belief system as me, you inevitably will be taking away some of my freedoms, right? So, or some of the things that I value. So in the case of, we'll just go extreme. So in the case of like the people who are more like communist minded, they say, well, by you saying that you just want to be free all the time, you're taking away my safety, because I want these securities, I want these things, and then the same goes on the other way. The people who want to be sovereign, and they say, no, I don't want these rules in place. I don't want these systems. And so it's kind of like I think it lends compassion to the opposite point. And when I went down this rabbit hole, I didn't I did not expect it to go the way that it did. And for me, ultimately where it landed, and yeah, ultimately where it landed was that happiness is objective, right? And it's interesting as an American, because this is in our founding document. We have these fundamental human rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's like happiness is completely objective. And I think that, these men didn't know really what else to say and how else to describe it. But, the one lion, he has the opportunity to be happy every day. He's got moments of boredom, and then he's got moments of happiness. Whenever that cage door opens and food comes in, there's a little bit of moment of happiness. It's like, oh, okay, I get a break in the day. I get a change. I get some food. This is pleasurable to me. The second lion, however, I don't even know that he knows what happiness is, because he's just living life, right? There is no times of like being forced to do things that he doesn't want to do. If he doesn't want to do something, he just avoids it. So it's not like he's trying to go and be happy. It's like his life is like an average of basically being, he's not bored, because how could he be bored? He's just doing what he wants to do. So it's like, are we meant to be, this is a very long-winded way to ultimately get to the question that I kind of responded to my dad with, which was, are we on this earth to be happy, or are we on this earth to live our ultimate purpose? Or maybe the question is, live to our fullest potential.
But I mean, is that framed as a mutually exclusive choice, though, Caleb? Because what if living to our fullest potential is being part of that journey that some people call happiness?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so, well, maybe I'll just use myself as a specific example, and probably can't generalize beyond myself. But to me, living and doing things that I find fulfilling, that give me meaning and purpose, are what make me happy. So to me, those two are the same. Now, can you think of would you say those are different things for you? Living a life of meaning and purpose versus pursuing happiness? Are those separate paths?
Okay, so it feels to me like the first lion, his sense of happiness, let's see, he has like a sense of happiness which is somewhat empty, I guess, because it's like, because it's really based in. What is it really based in? So the basis of his existence is the cage, is a deprivation of his sovereignty. And so when he gets a glimmer of happiness, like I'd said earlier, it comes when that cage door opens. So it comes in the form of food, whereas to the food to the other lion is just life. It comes in the form of the excitement of the unknown, of where that person, the zookeeper, where he's coming from. Where does he come from every time? And the unknown of what's on the other side of that cage door. Again, these are things that the other lion doesn't necessarily have. So it was like, I think that where I was getting hung up when my dad asked the question about happiness is like, we are defining, how do you define happiness, right? What is your happiness based? And you absolutely hit on something I think to be very, very important, which is your happiness is based in the happiness that you are trying to feel, that good feeling that you're trying to feel. That's basically what happiness is. It's just like a really, really good feeling. That good feeling that you are working toward is like, it comes from being able to express yourself very authentically, right? It comes from being able to things that you are genuinely interested in, that feeling of finishing a chapter, or sitting in the flow at your computer for 3 hours and at the blink of an eye not even realizing the amount of time that has passed. That is, to me, like a different thing than the happiness of the first lion. Does that make any sense?
I think where this is getting a little tricky, this particular analogy with the lions, is because I think we're switching between lions and belief, and then talking about belief systems that could shape perceptions of happiness,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
I just to be really banal for a second, I think the reason it's getting tricky is because lions can't have belief systems, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and I think so. When I answer the question, I always go to, well, and maybe this is a bit reductionist or essentialist even, right? But what is the natural state of being for a lion, right? Like it's an animal that it's not possessed with the same type of cognition that a human would be, right? So you assume a general broad brush animal instinct type of natural state of being for a lion, right? So given that, I can't. So when you talked about, if you go and speak to the pure essence of the lion, right? The pure essence of the lion, to me, is the one that craves its natural state of being, which to me is the prairie. There is no circumstance in which, for a lion, I'm talking specifically about lions here, right, or other
Right, yeah.
non-human animals. I do not think situation in which they're in captivity is preferable to them. Now, if you change it to adult human beings who've gone through all sorts of societal conditioning, and depending on what that conditioning is like, I think there is a case to be made that the lens through which they perceive reality, and that lens is completely colored by their experiences, how they were spoken to, and the conversations they had, and all the other conditioning that happened, right? That lens can completely change their perspective of, and then to your point, right? Maybe it's like the person who wanted to go back into the Matrix, right? Who said, "Look, I can't deal with this reality. I want that."
It's easier.
It's easier, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and that's sort of the essence of decentralized consciousness, and the, maybe not the essence, but that's something that is hard for us to toy with when we think about spirituality, because we want so deeply for people in Bitcoin, and this is relatable to Bitcoin too. We want so deeply for people to see this better way and to free themselves, because we see them suffering. Like what we see is, we see them in victimhood. We see them not living to what we believe is their fullest potential. So it's very difficult to see that especially when you feel like you have gone through something similar, but almost become aware of it, become awake to it, and set yourself free, unlock that cage door, and been like, oh yeah, this feels so much better. I have so much more room to run. But at the same time, we have to understand and approach with compassionate love and understanding that those people also are making their own sovereign choices as well. As painful as it is for us to see them go down the shitcoin rabbit holes and experience their own pains and their own sufferings, it's something that, it's like, I don't want to say I doesn't feel right just saying we just have to accept it, but I also want to respect their sovereignty. And I'm becoming, and I think this is the case because you've been in Bitcoin for a long time too, so you probably will agree with me, is that at a certain point you stop trying to just like outright kind of evangelize everyone into Bitcoin, and you just wait for the right moments and the right people to come along, the people who are following their authenticity. Those are the ones who are using their own sovereignty, their own choices to move into these higher realms of these new realms of thinking, these new realms of living. And once they're ready to do that themselves, that's when they're ready to be, that's when they're going to be receptive to these concepts. And I don't know why that seems to be so different than when we're children, for instance, we're kind of indoctrinated into these self-limiting belief patterns around everything and around money, and it's like it just happens almost second nature without us even realizing it. But then to break free, we have to be the one to deliberately unlock the cage. So it's like, what it seems like is like we're accidentally locking ourselves up, right, throughout life, unknowing it. And then when we're ready to get ourselves out of there, we'll defend ourselves in the cage. We'll defend our belief systems, and our egos will say, no, I'm attached to these ideas. I'm attached to these concepts. You're not going to change my mind. That's too difficult. Whatever the ego, however the ego chooses to defend itself. But then when we take the key and we say, yeah, I am going to exercise, being okay with exercising some humility, letting the ego die a little bit. That's something that we consciously do. So it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think, look, when it comes to shitcoiners, right? I know this is a podcast about spirituality, so I feel odd cursing on it. Maybe I'll use a different term, altcoiners. I think in most cases, it's probably better to let them find out the hard way, right? The illusion needs to be shattered. It can rarely be dissolved gently. And that the shattering of that illusion that eventually leads to that the grace and humility that comes from it. I think it's a necessary rite of passage for many, right? There are others who can break themselves out of it. Maybe they can dissolve the illusion gently, just through study or through a light nudge from a well-wisher, right? And it's in those cases where I've over the course of the last few years, I think I've developed a slightly better eye for who's ready for a small nudge and who's completely not going to be receptive, and they have to go through that process of the illusion being completely shattered. So yeah, I think for the most part, I very rarely give unsolicited advice to altcoiners. when I see them going down a certain path, unless it's someone I genuinely care about. But and then in some rare cases when I think there's a chance that a light nudge might move them in the right direction, I do it gently. But I think one of the issues I see with a lot of Bitcoiners, hardcore Bitcoiners, is their approach to orange pilling is completely tactless. In fact, I was at a Bitcoin conference. In fact, I was at the Bitcoin Film Festival in Warsaw in April, and there was one evening where I was, Monica was there with me. We decided to just get a drink at the hotel bar, and we went there and we bumped into one of the Bitcoiners. It was a nice guy. Met at a few conferences, and he was in the middle of a conversation with with in this case it wasn't a shitcoiner, it was a no coiner, right? Who'd somewhat heard about Bitcoin, but he was saying, "Oh no, I like my stocks, I like my bonds," and then this Bitcoiner saying, "No, you got to go to zero. You have to get Bitcoin, otherwise you're screwed. You're dead." And then he turns to me and he says, "Avi, tell him I've been arguing with this guy for the last 30 minutes." And I looked at the guy. The poor guy was just from the body language, he was cowering. He was, he was completely cornered by this Bitcoin, well-meaning Bitcoin maximalist who was being completely tactless. And so I turned to him. I said, "Hey, I can't remember what his name was, but are you happy? Are you happy with where your life is right now, with where your investments are and where your life is going?" He says, "Yes, I'm happy." Then I said, "Then you don't need Bitcoin." And at that point, you could see that man melt completely, and his muscles loosened, and he said, and then he had a couple of quiet sips of his drink, and he turned to me and said, "Okay, so tell me, why are you into Bitcoin then?" And then
Awesome.
we had. So I think I just brought this up to say that there are so many Bitcoiners who take an almost belligerent approach because there is a religious fervor to their belief almost that leads them to unfortunately unconstructive conversations such as these, where oftentimes at most it's either a nudge or, you know what, you just let nature do its thing and you step out of the way.
Yeah, that's quite a different approach than kind of like the toxic Bitcoin maximalist route that has become so popular over the past few years.
Yeah, well, also, I mean, Twitter is not real life. There's I think the toxic Bitcoin maximalists with who look like they're 6'5" and have laser eyes, and they look like they've sort of superimposed their faces on these Chad bodies, right, in their Twitter profile pic. You meet them in real life and they're the mildest people you've ever met, and you look at them and say, was that you who just tweeted these last three things? It's hard to imagine that. So I think a lot of them in real life are not quite as belligerent as they are on Twitter, certainly. Although, there are some exceptions.
Yeah. I'm getting this sense that the toxicity in Bitcoin maximalism, I think the last kind of, or maybe not the last, but like one of the strongest, let's say, parts to the foundation of it is also the idea that we need to defend, right? So, because that was one thing that was so amazing to me when I first got into Bitcoin in 2019 and 20, is to see these social attacks on Bitcoin and what it is, or really what it is not. And to see, basically, like Michael Saylor likes to say, it's like kicking a hornet's nest. And it's like, does Bitcoin actually need these people defending it? or can it evolve naturally? Do we actually need to defend it, or would our energy be better spent by approaching this thing with the creativity, this creation energy, this passion to actually go out and build something and to just be a brighter light for this whole crypto sphere, and to show the world that no, we're not going to take part in this nonsense, and we're just going to continue building things that work, and we're going to continue building things that matter and help people. I think that's a really amazing thing about it. So,
well, I think different people react to different forms of communication, and I think I guess that archetypical toxic maxi behavior, right? Or at least if you take the Twitter behavior and you somehow convert it into a real life manifestation of it. I don't think that actually happens, by the way. I think there's a much milder version in real life. But let's just say it were to happen, and continue on Twitter as well. I think that I do see a value in it, because it reaches certain people who would listen to my form of evangelism and say, "What are you talking? You don't sound convinced. Why did you tell me I don't need Bitcoin?" So that means you're not convinced either, right? So maybe my language doesn't work for certain types of people, right? So I think we all play our parts in this journey, Caleb. And the other purpose, I think, the toxic maximalists. I mean, look, you could call me a toxic maximalist. Maybe I don't use the words, but my conviction is as strong as theirs, right? And my rejection, at least in a personal capacity, of shitcoining is as strong as anyone else's. So in that sense, I'm pretty toxic in my maximalism. But I think that it acts as almost like not a wake up call, but like a BS checker, right? Because you have this extreme group saying and applying these absurd purity, at times completely absurd purity tests on people. I think it's okay to occasionally bump against that and then question your own recent path, and say, wait a second, this guy said, or this person said XYZ about me. What have I been doing, right? Have I really strayed off the path, so to speak? And many times you might not have. It's just an absurd purity test. But at other times, it's a good reminder to keep yourself in check. I'm talking about this, Caleb. I actually wrote a little blog post a year and a half ago called "Everyone is a Shitcoiner." Bitstein wrote a piece, a very famous Bitcoin piece called "Everyone's a Scammer" in 2014. Michael Goldstein. So mine was a somewhat of an homage to that. But I called it "Everyone's a Shitcoiner," and it's about really the absurdity of purity tests. Right? There is meaning. It's like the no true Scotsman. Right? At some point, everyone is going to fail some Bitcoin purity test, and you're not going to be a good enough Bitcoiner.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that this is the ever-evolving definition of what a Bitcoiner actually is. I don't know that that's a standard or a definition that we can actually reach or know or understand, because I think that really the basis for it is internal truth. It is a desire to find and live a life of fulfillment for each individual. And, it's pretty easy to encapsulate the fiat mindset, the old mindset, which is basically, try to get as much stuff and as much stuff, accomplishments, achievements, accolades, that kind of thing. It's very external, right? Externally driven. And this new mindset is something that is so different. And I think the window that Bitcoin gives to the soul is there's a lot of light shining through, for sure, because it continues to evolve, and we continue to hold one another accountable. And I think for the most part, we continue to do so in very constructive ways, despite some of the toxicity, some of the negativity in the space. I think that our honesty and desire to be genuine with one another is just like the most powerful thing about this group of people.
Yes. I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I was going to say something, Caleb, but I lost it. But that was, but yes, I do agree.
It's all good. Well, Avi, we are approaching our time here today. I would like to know where I can find your book, and where, I guess, how I can find you on Nostr.
Yeah, for sure. Like, you can, if you go to Amazon and type in Avi Burra 24, it should show up in the search results. That's the easiest way of getting a copy of my book. And if you're okay reading an ebook and you'd like to purchase this in Sats, just hit me up on the social media information I'm about to give you, and we can do an over-the-counter exchange for Sats. And you can find me on Nostr, primal.net/Avi, AVI. That's the easiest way. I mean, I don't have my NPub memorized. Which would be,
you don't yet. That's surprising.
Yeah, it's. I know the first few letters are NPub1 HQAZ, but I can't remember it beyond that.
Well, that's pretty good. That's more than I do.
but primal.net/Avi is the easiest way, and you can connect with me on Nostr. Shoot me a DM if you want to chat more, and then if you're still a fan of Elon Musk and the Dead Bird app, you can find me at Avi_Burra over there.
Yeah, that sounds great. And of course, you have the podcast PlebChain Radio, which everybody can find on Fountain, or it sounds like you can join live on Nostr Ness.
On Nostr Ness, but if you do want, we get most of our listeners after the fact. I think Nostr Ness used to attract a lot more folks, and then once people realized we were putting up clean recordings on Fountain, I think they just do listen on Fountain. And please do listen on Fountain instead, even though we're on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and what have you, because we want to support value for value, support our good friend Oscar Mary from Fountain, and keep that pleb wheel turning.
Love it. Avi, thank you so much, brother, for being here, and definitely going to have to do it again. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. I had a great time. Thank you for having me, Caleb. I mean, we actually didn't go that deep, right? We kept it on the surface in this one, but that's good.
Yeah,
maybe next time.
Yeah, it definitely ended up being a little bit more philosophical, didn't it? So yeah, we can definitely do another one where we go deep into the spiritual stuff, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Caleb. Bye-bye.